Good morning, from me, Tim. I think Dale's going to unmute his microphone as well, and maybe we can just have a quick tag and just a quick introduction. Dale, are you there?
Yeah, super. How's it, Tim? And how's it, everybody? What a lekker morning. Wonderful to hear some music. And thanks for the introductions. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Saskia and Nicole for organizing all the pre-work before this. It's really great to be here. Can I just say a word about you, Tim, before we kick off?
You most certainly can. I'm probably going to say a word about you as well. So go for it, Dale.
Okay, so Tim is somewhat understated in that CV, but I mean he's a very successful entrepreneur coming from a strong business background, and we've worked together on a couple of projects, and this is a great opportunity for us to collaborate again. And he'll tell you a little bit about it. We did an amazing project last year with a bunch of executives and creative people and a bunch of a really big cross section. He'll tell you who they were, and he works in a similar space to myself, thinking about the future with businesses, helping them to map out and to navigate where they're going, and has really done some incredible work with a number of businesses. I think that some of those listed on his CV are impressive, but he's really a master at what he does, and it's really a great privilege to be working with you today, Tim.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. Well, you've kind of taken some of what I was going to talk about in the introduction to our presentation, but from my perspective, it's a great privilege to join you all. And while I'm there, just our collaboration, Dale and I have collaborated on, as he says, a couple of projects, but Dale's also a little bit understated in the sense that his last sojourn into the shift from the sale, and I'm sure most of you have heard about the sale of Get Smarter into 2U, the global listed university. Dale was essentially instrumental in that whole process. So that's a culmination of, I guess, 25 years of his experience. Now he's a top-notch strategy coach and really drives business to that level. I think that was part of the outgoing part of that process for Dale and working on that project. So we were just blessed in a sense because COVID has been quite an amazing experience, and everyone has their own version of what's actually happened. So if I'm able to, I'll quickly just share my screen and let's get on with this morning's presentation. Again, I'm going to ask you just to make sure that you've all got a view of what I'm sharing here. I think you all do. You should see the montage, thumbs up, smiley faces if we've got it. Yep, that's all good. So in essence, let me quickly just get some of the tech working here. There we go. Let's get into essentially how Dale and I started really talking about scenarios more. And really, I think the whole world, our world in South Africa, but the whole world during the course of 2020 has a defining moment as relates to the impact of COVID-19. And for me, the 28th of March will go down in my history as South Africa's first day AC, which is the first day after COVID. And really what that boiled down to was a business that I had 10 years been building around scenario learning and strategy facilitation with executives in boardrooms. The last word of that sentence is essentially, the point is that it was all in boardrooms. So from lockdown, the government in South Africa essentially shut me down. So I had a scenario that I faced on the 29th, which is essentially, so where to from here? And some really amazing things happened as a consequence of that. And one of the things in my history, I'd done some work studying around the Monfleur scenarios. And the Monfleur scenarios were what South Africa would look like in 2002, so 2002, when thought about in 1992, around the change of South Africa from the past into the new democracy. So we all were enabled with WhatsApp, and as a result of that, I started talking to a few people, and one of the people that I was very fortunate to talk to was Dale. And Dale and I had a few chats, and he said, hey, what's happening? Let's have a coffee. And quite quickly after that, we started talking about scenarios. Now, we didn't quote it in Dale's bio, but right up in the beginning, Dale had done a master's in scenario learning. So he was probably the best person that I was fortunate enough to be, have in my path. And I say that because through the process, we both brought different things to bear. And we put out a short one-pager, which essentially said, what will the business in the Western Cape look like in December 2021 post-COVID? And what we thought would be curate this whole process, because we couldn't be in the same room, via WhatsApp. And very fast, within 3 hours, we had 256 people who all wanted to participate in this process. And what was quite phenomenal was that everyone was sitting in the same situation. So that's essentially how the initial part of our collaboration, which was then COVID scenarios, kicked off. Before going too far into the detail of that, I'll give you a quick high level before we get into the future of creativity and how that might fit into Divergence. Scenario learning is really a simple, well-worn process, but it's the rigor that for us makes the difference. We have a focal question. So in our question then it was, what would the future of Western Cape business be? In the question we posed to you to invite you into this is, what's the future of creativity in 2025? And through that question, we're able to then gather influences towards building scenarios that will ensure that as we tell stories about the future, whereas as Dale has reminded me a number of times, it's not about getting scenarios right, it's that we're almost never wrong. So in essence, the idea of scenarios is to create plausible stories of the future such that we can start planning for those inevitabilities. And so our journey started on the scenario learning exercise post-COVID. What would business look like in the Western Cape post-2021? Now, based on all of my experience and Dale's experience, we thought it would be important to bring this together in a coherent structure. And part of that structure was understanding why we were doing it. We were born out of curiosity and decided to engage the people who we knew would know best. That was the 256 people plus who got into our group. A set of values underlined what we did. It was all about making sure that we would engage. We'd be prepared to really go out there and be on the edge, be uncomfortable aiming high and be prepared to get it wrong, but to own it. And as a result, we'd leave things a little bit better than we found them. But this quote from Alvin Toffler probably sums it all up. If we can't unlearn and relearn things, then we will be illiterate. So for us in this COVID era, it was about being prepared to unlearn and relearn through the scenario learning exercise. In terms of the process, it was really inviting people 1 to 2 hours of their time to contribute. And we used a survey, just like we invited you to use, to develop some data. And the survey was a little bit more detailed than your survey. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, other than to say that we came out with just over 1,800 data points across essentially what's the PESTLE framework, the political, economic, legislative, societal, technological, and environmental frameworks. And just to drill down into one of them, here's an example of one of those domains where we essentially got individual data points. The yellow tabs are individual data points, which were then themed up into key themes. And as you can tell, we went through that in all of the different domains. And the big challenge was then to bring it all together to essentially identify what would be meta themes. And I know I might have made you a little bit dizzy there, but in essence, what we've got is the essence of our work, which was taking all those themes and then arranging them into meta themes, which you could then ask our groups to prioritize in terms of importance and impact on the future of the Western Cape business. And you'll see that coming through in the scenarios that we work with on the future of creativity. We then developed axes, the scenario axes, and I won't go into all the detail of that, other than to say that for the Western Cape, we came up with 4 key quadrants, and we've named them, and you'll see this idea coming through. This is the underpinning of scenario learning. And the quadrants were around the group being okay versus the individual being okay. So that was about the axis that we're all looking out for each other versus we're all looking out for ourselves, as well as the need for structural reform as opposed to lack of structural reform. And really, this is not the purposes of today. This is just to say there's the rigor in the background of what we did in our collaboration. And so you might ask the question, so what? Why do we do this? The reason we do this is so that we can prepare, as I said, for uncertain futures. And we can consolidate and develop an understanding of where we need to think about as we go forward and grow. So that just gives you a little bit of context as to what we were talking about there. Let's talk about now the future of creativity. And so I'm going to hand over to Dale in a minute to talk through that. The future of creativity, we asked you a questionnaire and we got some responders. What's exciting to know is that we had 58 people who were going to be in the session and 24 of them came back to us. And of those 24, we can calculate that we had 300 plus years of creative experience in the group. 65% spend more than 50% of their time in the creative space, and the majority of them are entrepreneurs, leaders, or owners of the organization. So we believe you've got a pretty qualified group of people who can participate in this building of our scenarios of the future creativity, which will hopefully guide some of those divergent futures that we're going to be talking about. So on that, I'm going to pass the screen over and the microphone to my colleague Dale. Dale, and you'll take us through the work that we did there.
Super, Tim, thanks very much. And what's unique about this, I guess, is that we're using data from yourselves in order to create these scenarios. So these are your view of the uncertainty in the future of creativity. And so what I'd encourage you to do is to think about, as I'm going through and giving you back your own data and kind of telling you what you've said, and then we've formed it and we've perceived and navigated it into a place where we can actually tell stories about it, is to think for yourself, where will I be in this story? Like, if this is the story of how creativity plays out between now and 2025, where will I be? How will it impact me? In what way? Everybody here in this room has got some link into creativity, whether it's a primary part of your role, or it's a part of your role, or it's an aspirational part of your role. You all have a link to creativity, and hopefully this gives you some food for thought in terms of how you navigate the next years. So let's get into this. The question we asked was, what does creativity look like in 2025? The real benefit we have is that great minds think differently. So we get this pooling of knowledge from all of you that we've now distilled into scenarios. So let's just take a sense and go, what are scenarios? You could interchange scenarios and stories. We really are telling stories about the future. That's what we're doing. And the earliest mention of scenarios, that's exactly what the person who really invented the modern idea of did, a man by the name of Herman Kahn. So Stuart Brand, who's the founder of the Long Now Foundation, he talks about scenarios, and he says it's about forming a convergent thinking about divergent futures. So think about that for a second. Convergent, we want to hone in and tell a specific story about very divergent futures. And as Tim mentioned earlier, we're not looking to be right. We're not trying to predict the future, but we're trying to cover our options and describe them well so we can challenge our mental models so that we're not wrong, so that we've at least not surprised. We don't wake up in 2023 going, wow, I never thought of that. So at the very least today, I hope you walk out here in about half an hour, an hour's time, and you've got some food for thought going, wow, I wonder what I would do in that situation or in that scenario. So a little bit of the background, it goes all the way back to 1962. I mentioned Herman Kahn. The history of scenarios is quite easy to look up. I don't need to take you through that in slides, but it's fascinating in a way in that it influenced major things like the Cold War. Probably Herman Kahn was one of the main thinkers about the US approach to the Cold War, this big standoff between the US and the United States about nuclear weapons. It's influenced Shell significantly. It catapulted Shell from being the laggard in the competitive profitability amongst the big oil companies to the top, just because they used scenarios to navigate the future and to think about how they're going to do the future. And in South Africa, it's been fascinating. Tim mentioned Monfleur, but some of you might have heard Clem Sunter talk. He's been a friend and a mentor to me. He helped us last year with our Western Cape scenarios. He helped me when I did my thesis. South Africa has really been influenced by scenarios. Those Monfleur scenarios that we spoke about, Trevor Manuel, I was fortunate to meet him and chat to him about it. And he says he could close his eyes and he can remember those scenarios today. So that name and the stories that were told at Monfleur, he can remember. Tito Mboweni, our current finance minister and previously the governor of the Reserve Bank, says, he said in his swearing-in speech, you could go and Google it, he says, well, I could basically, we will not be Icarus, which was one of the scenarios, which was the story about South Africa flying high and then crashing and burning. And F.W. de Klerk, who also saw the Monfleur scenario, says, we will not be an ostrich, which was also the name of one of the scenarios. So I'm hoping that out of today's session, some of the names of the scenarios will stick with you in a similar way and shape and help you to think more critically about creativity in the future. So scenarios are stories about the future. but the purpose is to make better decisions in the present. And that's really what we're going to do with the data you've provided us. We asked the question, what's uncertain? What are you unsure about in terms of creativity in the next years? We've distilled that down. This is what it looked like in our case. So we pulled that together. We took all the data points. We distilled that into a funnel, and we said, right, what are the themes? These are the themes that we've picked out. And we've now worked with those themes, and we've come up with two big uncertainties. The two big uncertainties that we think, based on the data you've given us, facing creativity, are the question about openness, and this is about openness of society, openness of businesses, sharing, working together, collaborating, openness, and I'll put a little bit more meat on that in a minute, and technology. So what happens with technology in the future? Does it become more distributed? Does it open up? Does it give us, or does it, is there lots of collaboration, or does it become very narrow and controlled and centrally controlled? And I'll explain that in a few minutes. But first, let me tell you the story. So the stories are the different views of what could happen between now and 2025. Very open to questions as we go through. So if anybody has any questions, you're very welcome to just pop them into the chat, and Tim will watch out for them while I'm talking, and I'll watch out while Tim's talking. So you're very welcome to ask questions as we go through. So let's go into the first story. The first story we have called Frustrated. And this is a story about creativity squandered. And what I mean by that is, if we take a step back and we go, I can remember being a young boy, and Dan, you pointed out, when we were young boys, it was quite a long time before your parents even had a glint in their eye. So I remember sitting as a young boy thinking, wow, I would love to be connected to the world. And my version of connected to the world was to have a telephone on my desk and a ham radio. Now, both of those you probably need to Google, because not many people have landlines anymore and rotary telephones. But that was the picture I had in my mind, and a ham radio, which was this two-way radio that people could speak. But that was the extent of the technologies in the 80s, 70s, 80s. If you think what's happened in the meantime, it's amazing. We've got cell phones, and we can connect with anybody anywhere in the world, send a WhatsApp to a friend anywhere, anytime. We can keep up with people. We've got fiber connecting our houses. We've got 5G connecting our streets. But actually, what have we done with it? We've built social media and fake news, and we've kind of got this world where technology is used to spread information, a lot of which, when we get a WhatsApp from our friend telling about the latest thing about COVID, we have to triple check it on Snopes to see, is it true or not? And the best we've got really from a creativity point of view is these huge behemoth social media companies that control a lot of us, and have to post things in our newsfeed saying, if you really want to be my friend, copy and paste this, so we can kind of, hack the AI that's deciding which friends we're going to see. And this is a story about the future being more of the same. So saying the technology is amazing, it is distributed, it allows us to do all these things, but actually the creativity is not brilliant. We end up in a situation where a lot of the technology is used for these fairly banal kind of things. We're not really using it to solve big world problems. So let's have a look at what some of that could look like specifically. The first is that we see a big uprise in China. WeChat actually takes on Facebook, and the world becomes, we end up we spent the last 4 years hearing what Trump did on a daily basis. We now hear what the two biggest social media companies do on a daily basis. Blockchain, which we've seen a lot of movement on in the last year, particularly the last 3 or 4 months, actually spend a lot of their effort and time are building social media and transforming social media so social media works better. And fake news becomes kind of mainstream, that everything we read anywhere, even the BBC, we have to decide, is it true or not? And we end up in this situation where there's so much promise of what innovation could be and what we could be doing, but we've got our heads down and we thinking about things just in the way that they've worked in the past, and we don't really take a leap forward. And so this is the scenario of Frustrated, and those are some of the key things that might happen that would indicate that we're on to this scenario of Frustrated. So that's the first story. It's not a brilliant story from a creativity point of view. It is probably, as its name says, a little bit frustrating. There's so much potential, but we just actually don't get there. All right, so then let's go to the second story. The second story is Strangled. It sounds even worse, doesn't it? So this is about creativity constrained. And what happens here is that basically to fix some of these things about these huge behemoth companies getting more and more power from technology, governments decide they need to step in. And they step in and they decide we've got to regulate this, we've got to put more controls all around it. And they do this by regulating, firstly, the social media companies, limiting what they can do, breaking the companies up so that they have to operate as separate units. forcing them to be more transparent in what they're doing. Specifically, some of the things happening in the whole cryptocurrency space get regulated and much more tightly controlled. And this creates a stranglehold on the technology. So we end up in the situation where things are very controlled, and technology actually starts to take a step backwards. All the promise of what it could be doesn't actually materialize. So we see some things. We see some of the signs would be Bitcoin crashes composed down into the cents. Unfortunately, we're all sitting here and we're online because we'd love to be in a meeting, but we can't because of COVID-19. But actually, COVID resurges, and it doesn't resurge so much exactly in the same way, but it resurges in these little outbreaks around the world with different variants. Vaccine, it's a constant game of whack-a-mole, trying to find vaccines to put out these new COVID 20, 21, 22, and 100 other different names. And it's regional and citywide, and different places in the world are popping up. And COVID becomes a way of life. We live with it forever. 2024 was to see Donald Trump getting re-elected as the president, and doubling down on his America First, excuse my language, stuff the rest of the world, everything's about us, we're going to fight for ourselves, and overly controlling. And now, even emboldened because he's back, he comes back and he controls things even more. And we see China using the technology very cleverly. And this was some of the points that people mentioned in terms of rise of China and a different power dynamic in the world. That was some of the data that you guys gave us. And we see that as maybe China, which they've already announced, using the blockchain for their own currency. So they use the technology, but in a very controlling, autocratic way, which is the way. So this is the strangled scenario, the second of our 4 scenarios. And those are some of the things that we would see. And you could almost, save the slide and think about it when you're sitting in 23 and 24. You could go, if these things happen, then we're probably on the road to the strangled scenario. All right. So that sounds, we started on definitely the more darker side of the scenarios. Let's start working our way through what are some of the possibilities on the other side. And the first scenario on this end we've called paint by numbers. And this is where governments and countries, the governments and companies actually start to vie for control. And we see this already with some things. So we see in Australia saying that Facebook can't publish news, and there's a big fight going on, a legal fight. And Facebook said, okay, we'll switch off all the news feeds in Australia. This happened last week. And we see these tussles between companies and countries between each other, and companies between each other. And there's this fighting. And what happens is there is creativity, but it's a very defined creativity. It's not creativity in the sense of an openness and expansiveness and the kind of environment that really encourages new things to be found. It's done in a very controlled way, which is why we've called it paint by numbers. It's a paint by numbers where we literally get told what to do, how the pieces fit together, very controlling. The technology and what we do with the technology is very interesting, and it creates all sorts of new things in our world which become very competitive. So, for example, let's look at some of the things that might happen. The International Space Station shuts down because there's no longer cooperation, but Tesla takes it over. And this is the SpaceX takes it over, and this is Elon Musk's Tesla being launched into space. So you suddenly get privatization of space, which, if you go back a quarter of a century, was very much a government initiative because it was for the good of everybody. Now it becomes a private initiative for the good of commercial interest. And we want to colonize Mars, so let's own space. And how do we own space? We actually take property, etc. Other thing that happens is there's a tremendous amount of hacking, an upsurge in hacking. So Russia has always been fairly dominant, as has America, in their hacking, but this steps up to a whole new level of hacking between countries, trying to interfere with elections, trying to fight and get people into a stronger position. Companies stealing and espionage, so using the technology in those ways to actually try to further their creative interests, but very much specifically around their interest. There's not a lot of collaboration, and you end up in a situation with a huge fight between companies and countries where everybody vying for holding on to their piece of the pie, not very much collaboration at all. So we've called it paint by numbers. There is creativity, there is innovation, there are new things happening, but it's happening in a very defined way, controlled by this sort of meta theme of companies and countries competing for each other. So we've put it paint by numbers, and those are some of the things that you can see and we'll both Tim and I will share all our slides with you afterwards, so you can pour through it. But those are some of the things that you could see, which would be an indication that we're going down this paint by numbers scenario. So then the last scenario, which I'd like to talk about, which I have really saved the best for last. Now, I have to warn you, because scenarios, we all have a tendency as humans to want to tend towards the more positive. What's the good story? And let's hope that the good story. But remember what I said at the beginning. What's important here is not that we predict in the future, but rather that we're making sure that we're not wrong about the future. So as much as we want the good scenario to come out and be the one that we live in, we actually have to balance that against, hang on a second, maybe we need to think about some of the negative ones and pay attention to them, because we can learn from that, and we can figure out how we can navigate and how we can manage ourselves and manage our work lives, our business, our personal lives in a different scenario, even if that is a negative scenario. All right. So we need to get away from labeling positive, negative. We hope for the positive when we reject the negative, but more to, we're open to all of them, and let's see what we can learn from them. So let's go to the fourth scenario, which we've called the Roaring Twenties. In the 1920s was after the Spanish flu pandemic, and it was after World War One. Interesting thing about the Spanish flu pandemic was that it killed a lot of young people, 50 million people. So we think we're in a bad pandemic, but 50 million people is a huge number. So you can imagine the dampen that put on the world over that period. At the same time, the world had been at war, World War One, a horrific war, terrible, which I don't need to belabor. So it was an interesting time, because the young people had significantly been affected by that. And coming out of it in the 1920s, there was this resurgence of art and creativity and freedom and economic growth that came off the back of it. And it was a lot of the young people at that time being exuberant about, we're free, we've left behind these dark, terrible days, a lot of the constriction, a lot of the censoring, many levels of society. Things started to open up and started to become much more open, prosperous, economic growth, etc. And we're thinking that we could be really at the start of that now, as we're sitting in 2021, coming off the back of a pandemic, the technology, what has happened with technology to date, and how that has opened up, and now we're going into a stage where we really start to get creative and use this technology in amazing ways. So some of the things going on, which are really on, Facebook are doing their Facebook Horizon, their whole virtual network, which is the next iteration. So this is virtual reality glasses that you put on, and you can create this world where you can live and exist, and you can create things, and you can make things, and you can share things, and you can collaborate, and you can learn things, and it pretty much emulating a lot of the things that we have in our world, but you can do it virtually. And the virtual world just allows more openness and more things that we couldn't do before. The other thing which is going on at the same time is an idea that came out of Neil Stephenson. I don't know if anyone's a fan of Neil Stephenson. He's a great author. His book from 2003, I think, called Snow Crash, he spoke about metaverse. So the interesting thing that's going on in the world is the gamers, these gaming engines and the games that are happening around us in the world are creating elements of this metaverse already. So in Venezuela, when their currency crashed last year, people figured out that mining gold for Fortnite actually was a worthwhile thing to do. You could mine it and sell it and make real dollars and live, and you could actually live above the national average age of people in Venezuela at the time. In China, there are large farms of people mining collateral for video games and selling them in the real world. The difference is, at the moment, it's still centrally controlled. And what we think is that this could open up into a new space where it actually becomes operated on blockchain, where it's much more democratized, where you have contracts on using Ethereum, for example, which can dictate how these transactions could take place. And people could start to spend more and more time in this virtual world. You might have seen this in December, an artist by the name of Beeple. This was a day after the arts started selling. 582,000, actually ended up to be 3.6 million. It was the largest art sale. Non-fungible tokens, which is basically a deed of sale for a piece of digital collateral, which in this case was art. People are starting to buy art and collect art, and they're starting to buy pieces of land in this metaverse, which is which is starting to appear. So what was written about 20 years ago by Neil Stephenson is starting to emerge, and there's actually some very good evidence, not only evidence, but actual people are living. Fortnite's likely to hit 1 billion users next year. That's rivaling. That's 1/6 or 1/7 of the population of the earth is on this game, living in this game to some extent, sharing things, buying things, etc. And that while that might sound frightening and scary, you can imagine what it could open up in terms of creativity when people can be unhinged or unencumbered in any way in terms of what they are able to create. So I could go on. As you can hear, it's an interest area of mine, and it's something which is very exciting. The scenario we've called is the Roaring Twenties, and I've labeled there some of the things that could happen. Ethereum 2.0 launches seamlessly, which changes the whole world in terms of how blockchain works and what is possible with it. A metaverse protocol is published. There's a standard which gets agreed so that all these virtual worlds actually start interacting with each other. They're happening at the moment, but they're happening somewhat separately. So a protocol is published which pulls things together. Sotheby's reports in 2024 that actually they sell more art digitally than they sell in the real world. All right. And as we sit here in a Zoom call, having a meeting, which we would have probably thought unimaginable, why wouldn't we just get together? You can imagine the move into the digital world could really be plausible. And cancer is cured by a 6,000 person scientific team that's formed this year. And they take what they've learned from COVID and they apply it to cancer, and they work on it over the next years, and they collaborate in a way never seen before, using some of these virtual worlds. I don't know if you saw Kritiski Hospital this week. They did operations, spine operations, collaborating. Doctors wearing virtual reality headsets, so all the doctors around the world could sit and stand and comment on the operation and help on the operation as if they were in the room, but they were in rooms all around the world. So this is already happening in a way, and this is the scenario we call the Roaring Twenties. It's the catalyst for something incredibly positive, incredibly exciting from a creativity world perspective, and it opens up possibility in terms of living between both the analog real world that we live in day to day, but also the digital world. So the logic of them sits together like this. As I said, there's the two axes as we've put it together is the openness of society, development of technology, and those are the descriptors we've got for each of those four scenarios. So what do you need to take away from this? I said at the beginning, and just as I close, I said at the beginning that you need to think about this for yourself. So for each of these four scenarios, you need to think, what would I do in that scenario? How would it affect me? How would it affect my creativity? And here are some specific things, because these are obviously divergent views of what the world could look like, quite starkly different, some quite positive, some somewhere in the middle, some very negative. For each of these divergent scenarios, what is it that you need to do from a creativity point of view? So the first thing is challenge your mental models. We all have mental models of the world. We all believe the world works in a particular way. And hopefully, when you think and engage with these scenarios, you might challenge some of your mental models and think differently about how you see the world. Not that they're good or bad, but just to think about them differently. Secondly, you need to consider all the different factors, all right? And they're multiple. There's psychological, social, economic, culture, etc. There's many different factors. So there's a way to think through all the different pieces. And then tell your creative story. So that's what I've said is like, how does this affect you? What would your story be when the backdrop is one of the scenarios? And the last thing is identify your blind spots. This is a great exercise to do with friends, to talk through, wow, these guys presented these scenarios. What do you think would happen? What would you do? What would I do? What do you think? How do you think I would? Explore it with somebody who can help you to identify what you're missing. That's what I mean by blind spots. So I'm going to wrap it there. I'm going to step one back just so you've got the scenarios up on the screen and open up. If there are any questions, then very keen to hear what they are.
Well, there's no questions, a couple of comments in the chat, but no specific questions. So maybe I'll just pass it back to you. If there are any specific questions, and make an open mic, and we'll be guided by Philip and the hosts of Creative Mornings as to how much time we still have.
Yeah, I guess if we're wrapping it up in the next 5 to 10 minutes, it would be good.
100%. Sorry, that was Dan. Was that Dan? I think it was Dan.
That was full.
All right, super.
Cool.
I did spit in my head. Thanks, Anita. I guess that's the idea. You can probably tell from I'm a little bit animated, and Tim. I mean, we've had ideas spinning in our head as we got your data and we digested it and thought about it. We're like, wow, imagine that, imagine that. And this technique is just interesting because it gives an opportunity to actually structure it in a way to think about it in a coherent story. Any other comments?
And if I can just add, Dale, I mean, I think one of the things coming into this, and part of the reason we the opportunity to talk about Divergent is that that's the kind of dots joined in reverse now, because hopefully, if anything, we've shown through the process of scenario learning that actually we essentially have underlined the topic of today, which is we've created 4 plausible stories of the future for creativity in 2025. And so in essence, we don't have to call it out. You be the judge, you decide which is your divergent future, or more importantly, which one, and again, I'm guilty as charged because I'm saying choose a scenario. The truth is, like Stuart Brand always says, is we're looking at all of the possible opportunities so that we'll be almost never wrong. I see something coming up in the chat.
And yeah, I was about to say.
Hi,
Yeah.
and so I'm working in the healthcare field, so maybe different to everyone else on this call, I'm assuming. But just, just looking back at the previous year and how so I'll just call it Tim. I'm the acting CEO at Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital. And so having managed the COVID crisis in our hospital, this very thing of changing your mental models, we've really had to dig deep and really been through a whole change with staff and watching staff move at different rates to get them to a place to say, right, our whole world's been turned upside down. How do we carry on trying to think at things from a different angle, trying to still deliver excellent patient care, but doing things differently, and also working in a government sector hospital, things are done in a particular way and having to challenge that. So I think we at Red Cross have had the opportunity to work with our Children's Hospital Trust and other partners where it's more possible than at other facilities, but we really had to challenge our mental model. And so as we go forward into 2021, having had 2020's experiences, to think about, right, now how do we take this forward? Because it's not that thing of last year of, okay, we're going back to normal after that. That is out the window. We got to co-create a new normal. And actually the new normal is that there won't be a normal. The new normal is that you got to be up for constantly changing, adapting, being flexible, but having to take like a whole group of staff along the way, some of whom would be very open to it and a lot who are really not open to it. So I just think it's exciting. It's been a short talk, but I found it really helpful and sparking of some ideas. And Tim and Dale, we need to have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Happy to do so, Anita.
I don't see any more raised hands. I see a little comment in the chat, but I also said, I mean, like I tried to think of a question for you guys, and then I was like, I found myself just asking myself questions the whole time. like, what would you do? What would I do? Yeah, that's weird.
Perhaps just to build on that, Dan, I mean, I think one of the things, and Dale, in terms of the work that he does as a strategy coach, scenarios is a key part of what he does, because scenarios can talk to the globe, they can talk to nation states, they can talk to organizations, to teams, right down to individuals. And the work that I do, although it's not exactly aligned to Dale's, is that people, organizations or countries don't change, people don't change. But people only change if leaders change. So ultimately, the kind of conversation that Anita has just brought into this room is that conversation, is because we have to liberate our minds to divergent creativity. And what's interesting is when you say to someone, let's talk about creativity, there's you have a sense of, well, that's my perspective, but creativity isn't in the domain of necessarily art. It's
exactly.
It's across the board. In fact, sorry, Sue just asked me if she'd like some help. But yeah, so I think
a question there from Carol.
Carry on, Dale.
This question down. Yeah, you can address it.
Yeah. So Carol just asked, how do you approach people, spaces, work, etc., who don't have a value for clarity? So I guess we find this all the time, and sometimes it's obvious where people are very anti, and sometimes it's much more subtle. But my best, what we're talking about here, it's built a little bit what Tim was saying, is that people change, and people change through leadership. But it really boils down to individuals, and we've got to find what's the next small little step that somebody can take, because that's how, as adults, that's how we change. As kids, we make big leaps of change all the time. As we get older, we can still change significantly, but it typically happens differently. It happens because we have a significant change of context, or we have a significant change in perhaps some crisis, or we decide to do things in very small increments. And so my answer there, Carol, would be small increments. Just picking up other questions, information from the presentation available online. The information we'll share, I'm not sure if that's what you meant, Nadia. Maybe you just want to class. Accumulation.
Philip's got a question, Dale.
Yep.
Philip has a question.
Yeah, sorry, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just curious, for you on a personal level, when conducting those surveys and going through the huge amounts of information that you shared with us earlier, how often do you find, like, if you're going through other people's opinions, does that influence your own decision making, or your own way of, like, your worldview, that point of the survey's questions? Like, how much does that influence your own thinking about a specific topic?
Dale, do you want to answer that? I've just brought the data up in the background. So
look, it's all what we're dealing with is always our own perceptions of the world, and there's a lot of bias. So if you read people like Kahneman, and you understand we are all biased in many different ways. We're actually emotional beings. We think we're much more rational than we are. So we are always influenced, but there are some things you can do to manage that, and part of that is, which is why Tim and I did this together, is collaboration helps a lot, to have somebody to second guess and to think and to check your thinking. So we presented to each other and said, this is what I'm thinking, what are you thinking? And then we distilled it into something, because on our own, we are always biased. So you do get affected by other people. And what's beautiful about the process, though, is that it's kind of a journey, because you get into it and you start to explore. It's a learning journey. We always talk about scenario learning. You learn in yourself, plus you merge in all of that with what you do know about the world. So I guess, there are some attributes for scenario planners. You need to be open and curious and interested in what's going on in the world, but you also need to check your biases, because it's easy to kind of get stuck in your own way of thinking. So, short answer, you do get affected by others, and you have to somehow manage that to get to the best outcomes. Tim, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, Dale, I think I maybe just bear with me. The point to add, sorry, I just thought, I wondered if I was on mute and did my 2020 standard line. You're on mute. The point to add is that for me, the process, the rigor in the process, to come back to Philip's specific question, is you obviously bring in bias, to Dale's point. But this is underpinned by a concept in academia called grounded theory development. So it's constant comparison. And so there isn't, just like scenarios, there isn't one way that's always right. And I think, but through the comparisons, you're developing themes that are emerging that means that you're almost never wrong. So in essence, in the process, and then you apply other philosophical underpinnings like Pareto, which is 80-20. In 20% of the time, you're going to get 80% of the outcome. So this process of generating the data, and the rigor comes from the fact that it's not Dale and Tim's version, it's actually the people that are in this room. So the 24 people, we're actually just curators of your data. And as you'll see, that's why I wanted to bring this up, is that the people here will see their points that are on this. So it's very difficult for us to, in a sense, manipulate or manipulate the process, because it's your data. But what we hopefully we trust the process sufficiently to do our work that says, when we pass it back to you, which in a traditional process, we had a little bit of a limitation of time. So we did take that on board ourselves to create the prioritized axes of the scenarios, but we're pretty comfortable that they would have been intelligent from our point of view. So again, though, a group might do this differently, and we might come up with a different set of axes, but that's okay, because Stuart Brand, almost never wrong. Philip, I'm aware that we don't want to run too much out of time, and Dale, welcome. So I'll give it back to you. Where are we?
So I think Naset, maybe we can end off just with Naset's comment, and then pretty much we can go from there. I'll just have a quick word and thank you guys again, but maybe Naset can have a last comment and then we can close from there.
Cool.
if you
So
want
this
to.
is more of just a comment, and I suppose it's me just thinking out loud. As we mentioned, by virtue of being human, we do have these blind spots. So kind of considering scenarios in an unbiased format is almost impossible. And I think that was quite clear when COVID happened, and it showed how grossly unprepared countries and governments were in dealing with this pandemic, because they have planned for these scenarios. This is nothing new. These scenarios were planned for decades ago, yet we weren't able to kind of mitigate the consequences. So I'm just more curious about how AI will come into play and how machine learning on human behavior will ultimately kind of predetermine actionable scenarios as opposed to our human input in a way. But having said that, creativity, I think, is always something that is innately human. And it's creative problem solving that can guide a scenario as well. So I think there will still be that human footprint. But yeah, it's just more of a comment and me just thinking out loud.
Awesome. I don't know if you guys want to say anything to that.
No,
All
great
good, all
comment.
good.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Other
Awesome.
than just to say thank you so much for inviting us to participate today, and
Absolutely.
it's been a huge amount of fun. So thank you so very much.
Cheers. Tim and Dale, it has, like you said, it's been super awesome. One of the most interesting talks I've actually had to experience, like getting the audience to be a part of the talk and how your talk is framed was super interesting for me. And I hope it was for everyone else. We won't just close the room. We'll let everyone kind of slowly drift their way out. You guys can leave whenever you want, but a big thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekends. Happy Friday. Yeah, and let's enjoy it.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Dan.
everyone. It was wonderful.
Cool.
Thanks,
Great.
Dale. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Cool.
Good weekend. Cheers.
Yes.